Adventures in the Forgotten Realms is probably one of my most favorite recent sets from Magic the Gathering. Now, I am incredibly biased in this statement because I love Dungeons & Dragons and I am very familiar with the lore of Adventures in Forgotten Realms, so I understand that that makes me like the set a lot more than people who are maybe not so familiar with Dungeons & Dragons or Adventures in Forgotten Realms. But along with this set came an ability called Venture into the Dungeon. When you play a card that lets you do this ability, you will go through one of 3 dungeons of your choice displayed here. The effects are rather small and not too crazy, but as you go through the dungeons, once you get near the end and complete the dungeon, you get massive payoffs, especially if you do Mad Mage. But nonetheless, you can only venture into the dungeon if you cast a card or ability that lets you do this exact feature. But how much does it cost to adventure into the dungeon? Sure, the early levels are rather small and insignificant, but once you get to the later levels, they become pretty awesome to do. So how much on average are you going to be spending per turn to adventure into the dungeon? Before we answer that question, let's look at this card, Dungeon Descent. It is a rare card from the set, and it has the following text. Dungeon Descent enters the battlefield tapped. Once it is untapped, you may tap it for colorless mana, or you can tap it and 4 other mana and a legendary creature that you control in order to adventure into the dungeon, activate only as a sorcery. So Dungeon Descent, a rare card, says that it should on average cost you around 5 mana and maybe one of your legendary creatures that you control in order to do this once on your turn. So if we're going to be adventuring into the dungeon, it looks like we're going to be spending about 4 to 5 mana in order to do this ability, right? Let's look at some other cards that let you venture into the dungeon. Planar Ally is a 3 generic 2 white for 5 mana total angel card that, when you attack with it, lets you venture into the dungeon. So unless you have the ability to give this creature haste, for 5 mana and a turn later, you can venture into the dungeon. It seems a bit similar to Dungeon Descent in terms of mana cost and waiting a turn. It's a common, however, it's not rare, but okay, that seems to fit. Veteran Dungeoneer costs 3 generic and 1 white for a 3/4, and when it enters the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon. Okay, so it only costs 4 mana, and you get to venture into the dungeon the moment it hits the battlefield. You don't have to wait a whole turn. Okay, that's pretty good too. And it's also a common. Nadar Selfless Paladin costs 2 generic and a white for a 3/3 with vigilance. When he enters the battlefield or attacks, you venture into the dungeon. And we're not done. When you've completed a dungeon, all your creatures get +1/+1. He's the same rarity as Dungeon Descent, except he only costs 3 mana, and if you have a way to give him haste the moment he hits the battlefield, he can venture into the dungeon twice on that same turn for only 3 mana, and you don't even tap him because he's got vigilance. Okay, that's fine and dandy and all, but this seems to only be creatures that are reducing in mana cost. Precipitous Drop costs 2 generic and a black to enchant creature. When you enchant a creature, you venture into the dungeon. The target creature gets -2/-2, but if you completed a dungeon, it's -5/-5. That's only 3 mana, the same as Nadar, and you can enchant any creature on the battlefield, and if it only has a toughness of 2 or less, it dies. And you venture into the dungeon in the same turn. Oh, and it's a common card. All right, we're down to 3 mana. That's pretty cheap. It can't get better. Fate's Reversal costs 1 generic and 1 swamp in order to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. And you venture into the dungeon. 2 mana. Get a creature from the graveyard and venture into the dungeon. It's common. Okay, 2 mana to venture into the dungeon. That's pretty awesome. It can't get better. We've reached the tip. It can't get better than that. Kick in the Door costs 1 red. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains haste till end of turn. It can't be blocked by walls. And you venture into the dungeon. All that for 1 red. It's common. Dungeon Descent comes into play tapped. You can only tap it for colorless mana. You can tap 4 other lands and itself and a legendary creature you control to venture into the dungeon once. And only as a sorcery. Kick in the Door is 15 cents for a common card. Dungeon Descent is 50 cents.